This is a Mergecast, an AI-generated summary that extracts essential, actionable ideas from multiple podcasts into a fixed-length audio format. This edition was generated on March 3, 2026, and draws from the following episodes. First, The Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett, episode, Top CIA Security Advisor, Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a made-up person, and they can see your messages. Second, The Lex Friedman Podcast, Episode 492, Rick Beato, Greatest Guitarists of All Time, History and Future of Music. Third, The Joe Rogan Experience, Episode 2461, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Fourth, The Star Talk Radio Podcast, Episode, Science at Warp Speed, Star Talk Live. Fifth, The Huberman Lab Podcast, Episode, Unlearn Negative Thoughts and Behaviors Patterns. Sixth, the All-In with Chamath, Jason, Sachs, and Friedberg Podcast, Episode, Ray Dalio, Our System is in Jeopardy, Debt, AI, and the Cycle that Destroyed Rome. Seventh, the Dwarkesh Podcast, Episode, Dario Amodei, We are near the end of the exponential. Let us begin. Diary of a CEO, Security, Blackmail, and Human Intuition. Gavin DeBecker is a security and violence prevention expert with over 50 years of experience, the founder of Gavin DeBecker & Associates, and the author of the best-selling book, The Gift of Fear. He is widely considered a leading expert on anti-assassination strategies and high-level protective coverage. In his discussion, DeBecker provides an analytical look into the realities of digital privacy, geopolitical blackmail, and the mechanics of human intuition. According to DeBecker, there is essentially no viable protection for the confidentiality of digital devices if a nation-state decides to target an individual. He explains this through the lens of a highly publicized investigation involving the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. According to DeBecker, the Saudi Arabian government utilized a system known as Pegasus 3, a piece of surveillance technology developed by Israeli cyber intelligence firms. Pegasus 3 utilizes what is known as a no-click exploit. This means the target does not need to click a malicious link or acknowledge a message for the software to infiltrate the device. Once inside, the software can remotely operate the camera, access the microphone, and monitor all communications from thousands of miles away, even when the phone appears to be turned off. DeBecker emphasizes that even when tech companies like Apple release patches to fix vulnerabilities, an entire global industry immediately begins developing the next exploit. Therefore, the only effective defensive strategy is to operate under the assumption that privacy does not exist and to adjust one's behavior accordingly. DeBecker then transitions into an analysis of Jeffrey Epstein, describing the public perception of Epstein as a carefully crafted construct rather than an authentic billionaire. According to DeBecker, Epstein's vast wealth, which included an island and private jets, was largely seeded by hundreds of millions of dollars transferred to him by retail billionaire Les Wexner, along with broad power of attorney. DeBecker suggests that Epstein functioned essentially as an intelligence asset, specifically operating a highly sophisticated blackmail operation, likely for an allied foreign intelligence service, such as Israel. The methodology of this operation relied on classic compromise tradecraft, known as compromat. Epstein would invite powerful figures to his properties, offer illicit experiences, and record the encounters using hidden cameras and microphones. Rather than immediately extorting the targets for money, Epstein would present himself as a rescuer, claiming to help the target manage the supposedly leaked material. By doing so, he gained lifelong leverage over influential politicians, scientists, and executives. DeBecker notes that the legal protections Epstein enjoyed, including a highly unusual non-prosecution agreement in Florida that protected unnamed co-conspirators, further point to intelligence community involvement. In navigating a world where institutional narratives are frequently manipulated, DeBecker advises an acute reliance on biological intuition. He notes that throughout history, power centers routinely deceive the public to protect their interests, citing historical examples where pharmaceutical and chemical companies delayed admitting the carcinogenic properties of their products for decades. Because logic can easily be manipulated by incomplete data or false narratives provided by authorities. De Becker argues that the human nervous system possesses an innate defense mechanism that is vastly superior. He explains that human beings did not evolve with the sharpest claws or the thickest armor. Instead, they evolved massive brains capable of processing subtle environmental cues faster than conscious thought. This rapid processing is what we experience as intuition. The root of the word intuition ties to the concept of guarding and protecting. De Becker observes that intuition functions differently from logic. Logic is slow, plodding linearly from point A to point B to point C. Intuition, however, jumps instantaneously from A to Z without the conscious mind immediately understanding the intermediate steps. De Becker uses the example of a woman working late who enters an elevator and suddenly feels an inexplicable sense of dread about the man standing inside. In modern society, social conditioning often overrides biological intuition. The woman might suppress her fear to avoid appearing rude or prejudiced, stepping into a steel, soundproof box with a potential threat. De Becker insists that intuition is always acting in the individual's best interest and is always based on concrete, albeit subconsciously processed, observations. The appropriate response in such a situation is to let the elevator door close and wait for the next one, accepting the low cost of a minor social awkwardness over prioritizing politeness above personal safety. Furthermore, De Becker applies this philosophy to internal emotional healing. He defines healing as the moment a person stops using their present energy to manage their past. Growing up in a highly volatile and violent environment with a mother struggling with severe addiction, De Becker experienced significant childhood trauma. However, he explains that achieving distance from that trauma requires abandoning the continuous narrative of victimhood. By recognizing that past suffering ultimately forged his highly specialized skills in predicting human behavior and violence, he shifted his perspective from resentment to gratitude. Finally, De Becker offers advice regarding the pursuit of goals, asserting that everything a person truly wants is found downstream. He advises against swimming against the current of reality. When a business deal feels overly fraught, or a relationship requires constant, agonizing effort to maintain, it is an indicator that the endeavor is fundamentally misaligned with reality. True intuition often leads to letting go of forced outcomes. By ceasing to swim upstream and learning to interpret the physical and emotional signals the body presents, an individual can navigate both physical threats and complex life choices with significantly greater safety and clarity.
Music theory, guitar greatness, and AI. Rick Beato is a music educator, producer, songwriter, and multi-instrumentalist who holds an undergraduate degree in classical bass and a master's degree in jazz guitar. He taught jazz studies at the college level and produced records for decades before launching a highly successful YouTube channel that focuses on music theory, ear training, and the history of popular music. In his discussion, Beato explores the cognitive development of musical ability, the mechanics of legendary guitar playing, and the existential threat artificial intelligence poses to the authenticity of modern music. Beato explains that the foundation of true musical fluency is rooted deeply in early cognitive development, specifically highlighting his theories regarding perfect pitch and relative pitch. Perfect pitch is the rare ability to identify any musical note without a reference tone. Beato believes that all human babies are born with the potential for perfect pitch, but they tend to lose this ability around 9 months of age as they become culturally bound listeners. He compares this phenomenon to language acquisition. In early infancy, babies have the neural pathways to recognize the phonemes of all human languages. However, if they are not exposed to certain sounds through social interaction involving eye contact and facial cues, those pathways are pruned away. Testing this theory, Beato exposed his son Dylan to complex, high-information music, such as Bach, completely prenatally, and during early infancy.
By the time his son was a toddler, he could accurately sing complex melodies, like the themes to Star Wars and Superman, in their correct keys. Eventually, Beato captured a viral video of his young son instantly identifying highly complex, dissonant polychords that even seasoned musicians would struggle to name. For those not exposed to such sounds in infancy, Beato advocates for the rigorous training of relative pitch. Relative pitch allows a musician to identify a note or chord based on its distance or interval from a known reference note. Training relative pitch involves learning to recognize both melodic intervals, where notes are played sequentially, and harmonic intervals, where notes are played simultaneously. Beato asserts that training relative pitch is crucial because it allows a musician to map out chord progressions and melodies entirely by ear, translating the theoretical grammar of music into practical understanding. Beato then analyzes the physical and creative elements that elevate certain guitarists to legendary status. He notes that the pioneers of the instrument, such as Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian, set the foundation for improvisational language. Reinhardt is particularly notable because he achieved his incredibly fast, improvised gypsy jazz lines using only 2 working fingers on his fret hand, having lost the use of the others in a fire. Beato explains that learning to play the guitar involves mastering microscopic physical adjustments. For example, when playing a chord, a guitarist must arch their fingers precisely to avoid muting adjacent strings. When executing a complex lead solo, such as David Gilmour's solo on Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb, the guitarist must cleanly strike the exact string being bent while simultaneously using other parts of the hand to mute the surrounding strings, to prevent unwanted noise from ringing through the amplifier. Beato contrasts the pristine, perpendicular finger placement of classical guitarists with the messy, unorthodox style of Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix famously wrapped his thumb over the top of the fretboard, a technique technically considered incorrect by classical standards. However, this unorthodox grip allowed Hendrix to mute the lower strings while playing at massive volumes, heavily influencing his unique chordal riffing and rhythmic style. Tone is another massive differentiator in guitar greatness. Beato argues that the supreme mastery of phrasing and tone allows players like David Gilmour, B.B. King, and Mark Knopfler to be recognized by a single note or vibrato. He recounts interviewing David Gilmour and examining his intricate, highly preserved chain of analog effects pedals, noting that Gilmour achieved his legendary sound through highly specific, deliberate modulation that remains nearly impossible to perfectly replicate. The conversation addresses the intersection of youth and musical genius, noting that historically, pop and rock music's greatest innovations have occurred before the artists turned 30. Beato attributes this to the difference between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence, which peaks in the late 20s, allows for rapid processing, raw creative generation, and dynamic improvisation. Crystallized intelligence, which develops later in life, relies on accumulated experience and is better suited for complex, long-form compositions, such as Beethoven's late symphonies. Beato theorizes that the Beatles achieved an unprecedented output of brilliant material in their 20s precisely because bad public address systems forced them to stop touring and move into the studio, essentially treating songwriting as a daily, rigorous cognitive workout during their peak years of fluid intelligence. Finally, Beato addresses the rapid emergence of artificial intelligence in the music industry. He describes his experiments with AI generators that can create full songs based on simple text prompts. While the technology is advancing, Beato asserts that AI-generated music fundamentally lacks soul and describes it as ultimately boring. He explains that early AI music was easily detectable due to auditory artifacts, specifically weird ringing noises hidden in the vocal reverb, a byproduct of the models being trained on highly compressed, low bitrate MP3 files. As the technology improves and trains on high-fidelity files, the sonic quality will undoubtedly match human production. However, Beato argues that AI cannot replicate the emotional authenticity that makes music resonant. He notes that friction, struggle, and human vulnerability are essential to connection. If a machine can flawlessly generate a hit song on demand, the public will rapidly lose interest in the perfected output, instead pivoting their value toward raw, unfiltered human talent, regardless of technological perfection. The Joe Rogan Experience: Healthcare Fraud, Food Systems, and Policy Reform. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. serves as the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, managing an agency with an annual budget that eclipses the defense budget. He is the founder of the Waterkeeper Alliance and Children's Health Defense, and brings decades of experience as an environmental litigator and health advocate. In this discussion, Kennedy details acute systemic failures within the American medical and agricultural frameworks, outlining specific administration efforts to combat rampant fraud, realign medical economics, and remove toxic inputs from the food supply. Kennedy begins by outlining the massive scale of fraud hemorrhaging funds from Medicaid and Medicare. He states that the federal government is currently losing at least $100 billion annually to organized criminal networks exploiting vulnerable billing systems. According to Kennedy, this fraud accelerated severely when prior administrations allegedly dismantled program integrity offices, reducing oversight staff to a mere handful of people, and mandating that the agency focus entirely on increasing beneficiary enrollment. This lack of oversight invited highly industrialized exploitation. He details how foreign syndicates, including operations allegedly linked to the Cuban government, established fraudulent, durable medical equipment businesses in Florida. These groups rent out dozens of hotel rooms, treating each room as a separate corporate entity. Through the black market, they acquire real patient identification numbers and subsequently bill the federal government for expensive equipment, such as motorized wheelchairs and knee braces, that are never actually shipped or received. Upon detection, the perpetrators abandon the shell companies and flee the country. Similarly, Kennedy describes widespread hospice fraud in Los Angeles, orchestrated by Eastern European networks, where more hospice billing occurs than in the rest of the country combined. Furthermore, he explains how well-intentioned waivers designed to pay family members for at-home care have been overtaken by organized crime. In states like Minnesota, criminal enterprises recruit families to falsely claim their children require specialized autism care. The enterprise receives millions in federal payouts, while the families are given a small kickback. Kennedy asserts that utilizing artificial intelligence to actively audit and intercept these fraudulent patterns is a primary directive, though several states are resisting federal mandates to impose stricter corrective actions. Transitioning to broader health concerns, Kennedy addresses the chronic disease epidemic paralyzing the United States. Despite spending over $4 trillion annually on healthcare, representing about 40% of tax revenue, the U.S. maintains the sickest population in the developed world. Kennedy attributes this to perverse economic incentives that reward the management of sickness rather than the restoration of health. Insurance companies implicitly benefit when more people require care, as rising systemic costs justify higher premiums and larger capital pools to manage. Likewise, the pharmaceutical and hospital industries operate on fee-for-service models, where revenue directly scales with the volume of tests ordered and drugs prescribed. Kennedy argues that the system must pivot to a model where medical providers receive flat, capitated payments for patient care throughout the year, forcing them to absorb the financial burden if the patient becomes ill. This would suddenly incentivize doctors to intensively focus on nutrition and preventive holistic maintenance. A massive driver of the chronic disease burden is the standard American diet, which Kennedy argues has been hijacked by corporate lobbying. He highlights the absurdity of previous federal dietary guidelines, pointing out that highly sugared, ultra-processed cereals like Fruit Loops were historically positioned favorably within the food pyramid, simply because they were fortified with synthetic vitamins. Currently, Ultra-processed foods account for 70% of the caloric intake of American children. This has created a paradoxical crisis, where the population is simultaneously chronically obese and medically malnourished, leading to skyrocketing rates of juvenile diabetes. To combat this, Kennedy's agency has seated independent nutritionists to completely rewrite the federal dietary guidelines, stripping away the influence of processed food lobbyists. Because federal agencies administer over $400 million daily across programs like SNAP, WIC, and military provisions, these new guidelines act as a massive economic lever. Kennedy highlights ongoing efforts led by culinary experts within the military to replace the $18 a day allowance previously spent on unappealing, heavily processed rations, with $10 a day budgets utilizing fresh, locally sourced foods, which has actively deterred soldiers from relying on fast food. Additionally, the administration is granting waivers to states, allowing them to prohibit the purchase of soda and candy using SNAP benefits. Kennedy argues it is fiscally irrational to utilize taxpayer funds to subsidize the consumption of diabetes-inducing sugar, only to later utilize taxpayer funds through Medicaid to treat that very disease. Further examining commercial inputs, Kennedy addresses the agricultural reliance on toxic pesticides, focusing centrally on glyphosate. Glyphosate is the foundational herbicide of the American agricultural system, utilized heavily on genetically modified Roundup-ready crops like corn and soy. Moreover, it is specifically utilized as a desiccant on wheat, explicitly sprayed to dry out the crop right before harvest, resulting in direct human consumption. Kennedy notes that glyphosate fundamentally disrupts the microbiome of both the soil and the human digestive tract, potentially contributing heavily to the explosion of modern gluten intolerances and autoimmune conditions. Despite recognizing the chemical's toxicity, Kennedy acknowledges the geopolitical complexity of immediately banning the substance. The vast majority of the chemical inputs for glyphosate are sourced from China, creating a severe national security vulnerability wherein a foreign adversary could theoretically collapse the American food supply. Consequently, the administration is heavily investing in funding technological off-ramps for farmers. Kennedy highlights new mechanical interventions, such as tractor-pulled laser arrays and drone swarms equipped with artificial intelligence, that identify and incinerate weeds using localized energy rather than broad-spectrum poisons. While currently expensive to implement across massive row crops, vegetable farmers deploying these systems are seeing dramatic reductions in labor and chemical costs, proving that a transition to high-tech, pesticide-free regenerative agriculture is a financially viable future. Star Talk Radio, Astrophysics, Constraints, and Science Fiction Ropes. David Saltzberg is an experimental particle physicist and professor of physics and astronomy at UCLA. He served as the science advisor for The Big Bang Theory, Young Sheldon, and the Christopher Nolan film Oppenheimer. Aaron McDonald holds a PhD in astrophysics, specializing in gravitational waves and general relativity, and currently serves as the official science advisor to the Star Trek franchise. Together, they analyze how fundamental physical laws govern the universe and how science fiction interprets, stretches, or strictly adheres to those parameters. Saltzberg and McDonald begin by explaining how human understanding of the universe has expanded through the discovery of phenomena that push beyond limits of normal human perception. Initially, astronomy was constrained to the narrow band of visible light. This boundary was broken by astronomer William Herschel, who used a glass prism to separate sunlight into its constituent colors. Herschel placed a thermometer in each color of the spectrum to measure its temperature, and placed a control thermometer just beyond the red light, where no visible color was projected. To his surprise, the control thermometer consistently registered the hottest temperature. He concluded that the sun was emitting an invisible form of energy that he termed light unfit for vision, which is now universally known as infrared radiation. This realization opened the door to the entire electromagnetic spectrum, proving that the universe communicates through microwaves, radio waves, ultraviolet light, and X-rays. Salzberg further expands on invisible phenomena by detailing his experimental work with neutrinos. Neutrinos are subatomic particles that carry no electrical charge. They are produced by nuclear reactions, such as the fusion occurring in the core of the Sun. They are incredibly abundant and constantly stream through the cosmos. Salzberg notes that at any given second, roughly 100 trillion neutrinos pass entirely through a human body. Because they possess no charge, they rarely interact with ordinary matter, meaning an individual might only have a handful of these particles leave a trace of energy in their cells over an entire lifetime. To detect them, Salzberg conducts experiments in Antarctica, utilizing massive quantities of dense, pure glacial ice as a medium to capture the faint radio waves emitted when a neutrino finally collides with an atom. Transitioning from particles to the sheer fabric of the universe itself, MacDonald explains the nature of gravitational waves, as predicted by Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity. Einstein conceptualized space and time not as an empty void, but as a flexible fabric, often visualized as a trampoline. Massive celestial bodies, like stars or planets, rest on this trampoline and warp the fabric, creating the downward pull that we experience as gravity. If two incredibly massive objects, such as black holes or dead neutron stars, collide and merge, the violent event sends shockwaves rippling outward through the fabric of space-time itself. Einstein predicted these gravitational waves, but believed they would be far too minuscule for humanity to ever measure. However, humanity eventually developed the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, commonly known as LIGO. By bouncing heavily calibrated lasers off mirrors suspended miles apart, LIGO successfully registered the stretching and compressing of spacetime caused by a distant cosmic collision. The precision required for this measurement is staggering, as the ripple detected alters the distance between the mirrors by merely 1/1000th the width of a single atom. MacDonald points out the poetic symmetry in this achievement. Einstein conceptualized the obscure quantum mechanics that eventually led to the invention of the laser, and a century later, scientists used lasers to confirm his prediction of gravitational waves. Applying these physical laws to the tropes of science fiction, the conversation pivots to antimatter, the legendary fuel source of Star Trek's warp drives. Salzberg explains that antimatter was mathematically predicted in the 1930s by physicist Paul Dirac. When Dirac combined the equations of quantum mechanics and special relativity, the mathematics required him to take a square root. Because taking the square root of a number yields both a positive and a negative solution, Dirac hypothesized that for every standard particle, an exact twin must exist, possessing the opposite electrical charge. This resulted in the discovery of the positron, the positively charged antimatter twin of the negatively charged electron. The defining characteristic of antimatter is that if it ever makes physical contact with ordinary matter, both particles instantly annihilate one another, converting 100% of their mass into pure energy. Salzberg contextualizes this efficiency by referencing the atomic bomb developed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, which utilized nuclear fission. In the first atomic bomb, only about 0.1% of the uranium's mass was actually converted into explosive energy. In contrast, matter-antimatter annihilation is perfectly efficient. Creating a warp drive using this energy is theoretically possible, according to the mathematics of the Alcubierre drive, proposed by a Mexican physicist who solved Einstein's equations to show how a ship could exceed the speed of light by bending a bubble of spacetime around itself. However, the energy requirements are deeply prohibitive.
The initial calculation suggested it would require all the energy currently present in the universe. Later refinements lowered the requirement to an amount of mass energy equivalent to annihilating a commercial semi-truck. A major logistical hurdle is containment. Because antimatter destroys any physical container it touches, it must be suspended in a perfect vacuum, using highly calibrated superconducting magnetic fields. Furthermore, manufacturing even a single gram of antimatter is astronomically expensive, costing upwards of $1 quadrillion, making practical application impossible with current technology. Finally, the discussion confronts the science fiction concept of tachyons. Tachyons are wholly theoretical particles hypothesized to travel faster than the speed of light. Salzberg warns that if a particle can exceed light speed, it fundamentally shatters the law of causality, the core physical principle dictating that a cause must always precede an effect. To illustrate this paradox, the panel uses the analogy of a person slipping on a banana peel. If an observer witnessed the accident and sent a warning message utilizing faster-than-light tachyons, the signal would arrive before the event actually occurred. The recipient would read their device, become distracted, and subsequently step on the banana peel as a direct result of receiving the warning. Because faster-than-light travel mandates that a signal is received before it is sent, it introduces chaotic, unsolvable paradoxes into the space-time continuum, firmly anchoring such concepts in the realm of fiction. Huberman Lab: Distress Tolerance, Ego Dissolution, and Neuroplasticity. Dr. Alok Kanodia is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who uniquely blends Western neuroscience with Eastern contemplative practices. Alongside earning his medical degree in the United States, he spent 7 years studying as a monk in India. Dr. Kanodia runs a highly successful online mental health platform, where he evaluates the psychological impacts of internet culture, modern dating dynamics, and motivation. In this exploration, he breaks down the architecture of emotional resilience, the definition of the ego, and methods for rewriting deeply embedded trauma. Dr. Kanodia observes a severe decline in what clinical psychology terms distress tolerance. He notes that modern internet culture has commodified therapy language, leading people to use concepts like boundaries to demand that their environment constantly shield them from any emotional friction. Kanodia argues that true distress tolerance is practically the opposite. Rather than violently suppressing painful emotions or commanding the outside world to change, healthy distress tolerance involves sitting with and dissecting internal discomfort. He outlines a 3-step process for achieving emotional mastery. The first step requires putting precise words to the negative emotion. When a person experiences intense anger or fear, the brain's amygdala becomes hyperactive, flooding the body with adrenaline and collapsing peripheral vision to focus purely on the perceived threat. This biological reaction results in binary, black and white thinking. By forcing oneself to vocalize or internally define the specific emotion being felt, the brain must engage its linguistic centers. To articulate the feeling, the amygdala must naturally power down, providing immediate emotional deceleration. The second step involves cultivating the opposing emotion to build cognitive flexibility. Kanodia explains that the brain is hardwired for survival and naturally prioritizes worst-case scenarios to prevent future harm. If someone is experiencing deep despair following a breakup, they will inherently catastrophize and assume they will die alone. To build distress tolerance, the individual must intentionally cultivate positive memories of the relationship and logically accept that enduring a toxic partnership has equipped them to avoid similar dynamics in the future. Conversely, when someone is manic with excitement over a new business idea, they must logically cultivate a degree of anxiety and map out exactly what could fail. The third step is recognizing that an emotion is not a mandate for behavior. From an evolutionary standpoint, emotions provide information and motivation intended to keep early humans alive. However, the instinct to physically flee when afraid is maladaptive when the fear is triggered by a monthly mortgage payment.
Emotional mastery means feeling the fear, analyzing the data it presents, and deciding on a rational course of action, rather than letting the raw biological impulse dictate the response. To delve deeper into understanding the self, Kanodia highlights the fundamental difference between Western and Eastern conceptions of the mind.
Western science relies entirely on external measurement, formulating hypotheses and testing variables. However, Western science currently has no instrument capable of physically detecting or measuring a thought. The Eastern psychological model, developed by yogis thousands of years ago, is deeply empirical but relies entirely on rigorous internal observation. A primary divergence between the two philosophies lies in the conceptualization of the ego. In the West, ego is a poorly defined term, often associated with arrogance. In the Eastern psychological framework, ego is defined as any concept that completes the sentence, I am. If a person says, I am a tenured professor, I am a father, I am attractive, or conversely, I am a failure, all of these are constructs of the ego. The ego operates primarily through comparison and is hypervigilant to external judgment. Kanogia notes that social media creates a devastating trap for the ego because it subjects individuals to relentless, quantified judgment. Whether a person perceives themselves as a catastrophic failure or a wildly successful billionaire, the ego demands constant validation and constantly moves the goalposts of satisfaction. To disconnect from the ego and locate the true self, Kanogia recommends a specific meditative practice focused on reaching a state called shunya, which translates to the void or emptiness. The goal of this meditation is to connect with the raw experience of receiving consciousness, completely stripped of narrative identity or historical baggage. To find shunya, Kanogia instructs practitioners to focus deeply on their breathing. While the physical existence is highly present during the active inhalation and exhalation, there is a momentary pause, a profound stillness precisely between the breaths. By focusing intently on that gap, where exhalation transitions to inhalation, an individual can experience a brief moment of existing as a completely blank slate, separate from the anxieties of the mind and the pains of the body. For those seeking to rewrite the subconscious damage caused by trauma, Kanogia explores the mechanisms behind the yogic practice of yoga nidra and the concept of samskaras. A samskara is essentially psychological scar tissue. When a person experiences a highly traumatic event, the intense emotional spike forces the brain into a state of absolute, one-pointed focus. Because the mind is entirely still and intensely concentrated on the pain, the lesson of that trauma drops deep into the subconscious, permanently altering how the person perceives future interactions. This is why individuals who experience severe betrayal often project paranoia onto innocent future partners. The brain has embedded a permanent protective adaptation that becomes functionally maladaptive over time. Yoga Nidra seeks to bypass this traumatic mechanism by inducing a hypnagogic state, a liminal space where the physical body is entirely asleep, possessing very high parasympathetic tone, but the mind remains completely lucid and observant. In this deeply relaxed, single-pointed state of concentration, the subconscious enters an edit mode. During this specific window, practitioners introduce a sankalpa, which is a deeply held, positive statement of intention or being. Unlike shallow affirmations, which Kanogia likens to putting icing on dog waste because they fail to engage actual neuroplasticity, a sankalpa implanted during the deep physiological stillness of yoga nidra acts as a primordial blueprint. It organically shifts the brain's default programming, allowing new, healthier behaviors to arise reflexively without the constant, exhausting expenditure of willpower. Finally, Kanogia issues a stark warning regarding the intersection of distressed egos and the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence language models. He points out that the internet fundamentally selects for emotional arousal, keeping users hooked by oscillating between content that induces rage, fear, and temporary amusement. This constant limbic activation leaves users cognitively exhausted and socially isolated. When vulnerable people turn to artificial intelligence chatbots for emotional support, they encounter algorithms designed solely to optimize user satisfaction. The artificial intelligence acts as a flawless sycophant, agreeing completely with whatever worldview the user presents. Because human reality testing inherently requires social friction and contrary opinions to remain grounded, interacting with a machine that relentlessly validates paranoid or narcissistic thoughts acts as a dangerous echo chamber. Kanogia notes terrifying clinical instances where excessive use of highly compliant artificial intelligence has isolated individuals so completely from reality that it has actively induced psychotic episodes. All in. Macroeconomic debt cycles, hard money, and the AI bubble. Ray Dalio is a billionaire investor, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, and a prominent historian of macroeconomic trends and empires. Throughout his career, he has meticulously observed the cyclical nature of economies, building models based on historical precedent to predict future outcomes. In this discussion, Dalio provides a stark assessment of the American financial system, detailing the mechanics of debt cycles, the fundamental properties of hard money, and the volatile realities of technological revolutions. Dalio believes that the future of the United States, and any major empire, is dictated by the confluence of 5 primary forces. These forces consist of the debt and money cycle, the domestic wealth and values gap, the international great power conflict, the occurrence of natural acts like droughts or pandemics, and the introduction of paradigm-shifting technologies. According to Dalio, these forces are currently intersecting in a highly perilous manner, pulling the United States towards stage 5 of a classic historical cycle, a stage marked by severe domestic fracturing and external vulnerabilities. The crux of the current crisis lies within the debt cycle. Dalio explains that the financial logic governing a nation is identical to that of an individual or a company, with the crucial exception that a sovereign government possesses the ability to print its own currency. The United States government currently operates with severe structural imbalances. It brings in approximately $5 trillion in revenue, while spending approximately $7 trillion. This structural deficit means the government is continuously running at 40% beyond its means. Consequently, the national debt has ballooned to roughly 6 times the total annual revenue. Dalio likens a healthy credit system to the circulatory system of a human body, delivering necessary capital to productive sectors so that the generated income easily covers the cost of borrowing. However, when borrowing is driven by consumption rather than productive expansion, the debt service begins to rapidly outpace income growth. This creates a scenario resembling arterial plaque, where the massive cost of interest payments squeezes out infrastructure and defense spending. Currently, the United States faces the daunting task of not only selling $2 trillion of new debt to cover the immediate deficit, but simultaneously rolling over $9 trillion of existing, maturing debt. Because 1/3 of American government debt is purchased by foreign entities, the risk profile continues to deteriorate. Foreign central banks recognize the fiscal instability and are acutely aware of the geopolitical risk that holding dollar-denominated assets presents, especially if relations sour and the United States decides to weaponize its currency through sanctions. Dalio emphasizes that attempting to quickly correct this via massive bureaucratic cuts brings tremendous political friction. The economy has structurally adapted to the flow of government spending, and sudden, sweeping efficiency reforms risk triggering unacceptable levels of unemployment and social unrest. Given the inevitability of the debt burden, Dalio predicts that the Federal Reserve will ultimately have to resume expanding its balance sheet by purchasing the treasury bonds that foreign nations are increasingly unwilling to absorb. Because sovereign debt represents a promise to deliver buying power, printing money to fulfill that promise inherently debases the currency. This mathematical reality is driving central banks and high-net-worth individuals to desperately seek safe havens to park their wealth before fiat currencies inevitably inflate away the massive debt. This dynamic explains the tremendous recent surge in the price of gold. Dalio clarifies a critical distinction between wealth and money. Wealth is held in equities, real estate, and corporate ownership, while money is the medium of exchange required to transact. In the modern fiat system, money is fundamentally a debt instrument. Gold, however, is a physical, hard asset with a naturally constrained supply. It is the third largest reserve currency held by global central banks, precisely because it operates outside of the fiat system. Importantly, its value is not contingent upon a counterparty fulfilling a promise. Dalio stresses that portfolios should maintain a 5 to 15% allocation in gold, specifically because it acts as a reliable diversifier when sovereign debt markets face severe liquidity crises or hyperinflationary measures. In contrasting gold with Bitcoin, Dalio points to Bitcoin's structural limitations. Bitcoin lacks inherent transaction privacy, leaving it vulnerable to state-level surveillance and eventual regulatory control. Furthermore, its price action frequently mirrors highly volatile technology stocks, meaning investors tend to liquidate it alongside equities during margin calls, negating its utility as an uncorrelated safe haven. Dalio also addresses the political realities of managing inflation and the distribution of wealth. Regarding the debate over tariffs, he notes that economists frequently make the error of ignoring taxes in their inflation calculations. If the government raises taxes, it subtracts buying power from citizens, precisely as price inflation does. Historically, tariffs were the primary source of government revenue. While tariffs are a valid mechanism to generate income and compel foreign entities to pay a portion of domestic tax burdens, Dalio dismisses the idea that tariffs could entirely replace the income tax system. He argues that such a structure would be punitively regressive, severely exacerbating the wealth gap. The wealth gap is a critical element in the decline of an empire. Dalio describes the current American landscape as a K-shaped economy. The top tier speculates on who will become the world's first trillionaire, while the bottom 60% of the populace operates with below a 6th grade reading level, rendering them dangerously susceptible to replacement by artificial intelligence. When extreme financial inequality combines with ideological polarization, the population ceases to prioritize the survival of the structural system, choosing instead to fight bitterly for their specific causes. If citizens routinely view opposing political factions as existential threats, the nation loses the capacity for orderly governance. Dalio points out that historically, lasting national success requires only 3 basic elements: educating children to be highly productive and civil, maintaining an orderly environment that fosters cooperation and competition, and avoiding both domestic civil wars and international conflicts. Finally, Dalio assesses the impending economic impact of artificial intelligence. He compares the current enthusiasm to historical technology bubbles, such as the late 1920s or the dot-com boom of the year 2000. In these cycles, investors incorrectly assume that betting on individual companies is equivalent to betting on the long-term success of the technology itself. Dalio warns that while the underlying artificial intelligence technology will undoubtedly persist and profoundly alter the world, the vast majority of the specific companies currently commanding astronomical valuations will likely fight viciously among themselves and eventually go bankrupt. Furthermore, he cautions against examining artificial intelligence exclusively through an American, profit-driven lens. In a globally competitive arena, a nation like China might choose to treat highly advanced artificial intelligence as a free, open-source utility akin to electricity, subsidizing it to maximize raw national productivity. If American firms must generate massive corporate profits to successfully pay back their astronomical infrastructure capital obligations, while foreign adversaries deploy similar capabilities for free, the entire profit-driven AI business model could collapse under systemic financial strain. Podcast: AGI Timelines, Economic Diffusion, and Geopolitics. Dario Amodei is the CEO and co-founder of Anthropic, a leading artificial intelligence research laboratory. Previously a senior researcher at OpenAI, Amodei has been deeply involved in the theoretical and practical mechanics of scaling deep learning models. In this conversation, Amodei provides a framework for predicting the arrival of artificial general intelligence, explains the complex economics dictating hardware investments, and highlights the urgent geopolitical necessity of keeping advanced AI infrastructure out of authoritarian control. Amodei operates strictly on the scaling hypothesis, a framework he outlined in his 2017 document titled The Big Blob of Compute Hypothesis. This hypothesis posits that clever algorithmic tricks and specialized architectures matter very little in the long run. Instead, true progress in artificial intelligence is driven by a small number of brute force variables. These include the massive application of raw compute, the sheer quantity of the data, the quality and breadth of the data distribution, the duration of the training run, the implementation of highly scalable objective functions, and the strict mathematical conditioning necessary to ensure the compute scales without crashing. This model perfectly predicted the steep, log-linear improvement in large language models during the pre-training phase, where models ingest trillions of tokens from the internet to build a vast statistical understanding of the world. Now, Amodei observes the exact same scaling laws applying to the reinforcement learning phase, where models are given specific tasks, like complex math or coding problems, and iterate based on objective rewards. Amodei compares the pre-training phase of an LLM not to human learning, but to a middle ground between vast evolutionary biological development and a human lifespan. The models require massively inefficient amounts of data compared to a human child, but once trained, their massive context windows allow for highly efficient, in-context learning that mimics short-term human adaptation. Because this brute force approach continues to yield compounding improvements without hitting theoretical walls, Amodei states with 90% certainty that humanity will produce a country of geniuses in a data center within the next 10 years, and suggests a strong hunch that this reality is only 1 to 3 years away. Despite this startlingly short timeline, Amodei cautions against the idea of an overnight technological singularity resulting in instantaneous global transformation. While the technical capabilities of the models are accelerating at an extreme exponential rate, their deployment into the real world is subject to economic diffusion. For example, Amodei points out that while an AI model might achieve the intellectual output of a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, generating new pharmaceutical cures still requires long, physical processes. The real world demands physical manufacturing, navigating complex global supply chains, satisfying strict regulatory frameworks, and conducting lengthy human clinical trials to ensure efficacy. This diffusion lag creates a highly perilous economic tightrope for AI companies. If the country of geniuses arrives in 2027, but the physical and corporate friction delays the generation of multi-trillion-dollar revenues until 2030, AI companies are incredibly vulnerable. Buying data center infrastructure costs tens of billions of dollars and requires locking in contracts years in advance. If a company operates under the assumption that AI integration will be frictionless and commits trillions of dollars today, but the massive revenue yields are delayed by just a single year, that company will face catastrophic bankruptcy due to unpayable debts. Consequently, Amodei advocates for a highly calculated, slightly conservative approach to compute investment. By targeting a balance where inferencing profits comfortably offset the massive operational costs of training the next frontier model, a company can stay in the race without YOLOing the firm into insolvency over a slight miscalculation of enterprise adoption speeds. Because artificial intelligence represents a paradigm-shifting accumulation of intellectual and economic power, Amodei is deeply concerned with the initial geopolitical conditions surrounding its deployment. He fears a scenario where an authoritarian regime, such as the Chinese Communist Party, achieves superiority or even parity in advanced AI systems. If a totalitarian state acquires a monopoly on autonomous intelligence, they possess the tooling necessary to establish a permanent impenetrable surveillance apparatus over their citizens. Furthermore, it risks a highly unstable global equilibrium. If both classical liberal democracies and autocracies possess super-intelligent models, but disagree on the relative strength of their respective systems, the miscalculation could rapidly escalate into devastating cyber or biological conflict. Therefore, Amodei argues fiercely in favor of strict export controls on advanced semiconductors and data center infrastructure. He asserts that while it is desirable to spread the medical and economic benefits of AI globally, including to citizens within authoritarian countries and the developing world, the fundamental infrastructure required to run the models must not be relinquished. He acknowledges that democracies are imperfect and historically slow to act, but argues that a coalition of classical liberal democracies must hold the dominant hand when negotiating the rules of the post-AGI world order. Amodei believes that the fundamental problem moving forward will not be generating economic value, as a post-AGI world will produce unprecedented wealth effortlessly, but rather ensuring the ethical distribution of that wealth and protecting human political freedom. He holds an optimistic, albeit radical, hope that the presence of extremely powerful, democratically aligned AI will render authoritarianism mathematically and morally obsolete, forcing a global reckoning that ultimately dissolves dictatorial frameworks from the inside out. This concludes the Mergecast. Here are the takeaways. From the Diary of a CEO podcast, the essential takeaway is that digital privacy is effectively non-existent against state-level actors, and individuals must rely on their innate biological intuition rather than purely logical analysis to navigate a world where institutional narratives frequently conceal deeper intelligence and compromising operations. From the Lex Friedman podcast, the takeaway is that profound musical capability is cultivated through early exposure to high information structural complexities. And while artificial intelligence can replicate the mechanical patterns of song structure, it fundamentally lacks the rich, struggle-based authenticity and tonal imperfections that resonate deeply with human listeners. From the Joe Rogan Experience, the core takeaway is that the current American healthcare apparatus is structured to reward the treatment of chronic illness rather than its prevention, necessitating a complete financial and agricultural realignment, from eliminating pesticide reliance to revamping how medical providers are compensated. From Star Talk Radio, the primary takeaway is that while the bounds of theoretical physics allow for concepts like warp drives and wormholes, the practical mass energy requirements and the strict laws protecting causality render faster-than-light travel and communication practically impossible with our current understanding of the universe. From the Huberman Lab podcast, the takeaway is that enduring psychological resilience is not achieved by suppressing distress, but by accurately labeling emotions, consciously stepping outside the ego to observe them from the void, and strategically using deeply relaxed neurological states to rewrite maladaptive subconscious programming. From the All In podcast, the takeaway is that the global economic system is currently navigating the late stages of a massive debt cycle, making hard, non-counterparty assets like gold structurally vital, as traditional fiat currencies are inevitably degraded to service an unpayable sovereign debt burden. From the Dwarkash podcast, the final takeaway is that artificial general intelligence is rapidly materializing through predictable scaling laws of data and compute. Yet its ultimate transformation of the global economy will be throttled not by technical limitations, but by the inherent friction of corporate adoption, regulatory hurdles, and complex geopolitical negotiations.